What if I told you that one of the greatest geniuses in history didn't start out that way? In fact, at age 18, David Hume here completely broke his own brain. He was suffering from a condition he called the disease of the learned. He couldn't concentrate. He also had zero motivation and found himself spiraling into a deep depression that doctors of the 18th century tried to cure with hysteria pills and pints of wine. David Hume did ultimately recover, but not thanks to the fashionable cures of his time. No, he re-engineered his mind using learning tools that have been scientifically validated in our time, but weren't necessarily accepted in his. And thanks to his recovery, David Hume went on to accomplish many polymathic achievements in history and in philosophy. And specifically in philosophy, he even destroyed the argument that there are no atheists in foxholes. Every time I hear this, there are no atheists in foxholes, I think about David Hume, because he was a fox, he was in a hole, and he was an atheist. And when I say that he made achievements in philosophy, that's underplaying it. Hume almost single-handedly overturned Western philosophy. And even as an atheist, he died one of the happiest and calmest men in history. How did he do it? He used a specific set of learning protocols, strategies that look suspiciously like the self-inquiry and memory tactics that I teach today. And one tactic in particular is very strange, and it's almost forbidden in the way that some university students study today. They cram, whereas what Hume did was genius, and it led to genius because it helped him break through his depression. And there's another hidden and sometimes almost forbidden connection that involved Jesuit monks and an ancient Eastern philosophy that helps explain exactly how David Hume changed his mind from desperation and depression to absolute victory. So if you're feeling burnt out, distracted, or suffering from your own disease of the learned, you need to watch this video in detail. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmemorymethod.com. In case we haven't met before, I'm really into memory and learning techniques, but not just because I'm a memory guy. I'm also a researcher who has spent a lifetime obsessed with how the brain works and how the brain sometimes doesn't work. And I've long wanted to tell you about David Hume and what I've learned about him and from him, especially since I've given a TEDx talk on how learning techniques saved my own life from mental darkness. And I'm so passionate about having survived the darkness because Hume and his struggle and my struggle, none of this is unusual, but often we think that it is, or people don't talk about it, so it seems more unusual than it is. But it's what a lot of us, including you and I, deal with every day. Information overload, the pressure to succeed, and the noise in our heads that we just can't seem to shut off no matter what we do. So, today, let's reverse engineer the Hume method so you can cultivate a mind that isn't just smart, but also victorious over the darkness. Now, Hume discovered all kinds of controversial things, but one in particular is a good place to start, and it's controversial even to this day amongst some people, and that's the idea that the institution of education is not the education. Hume famously said that there is nothing to be learned from a professor which is not to be met with in books. Now, personally, I don't agree with this. I've learned so much from professors, and I've learned a lot from professors in collaboration with reading books that either the professors told me to read or that I read and then it matched onto something that professors said. But I think Hume still has a point. You get the most out of what you do in any educational setting by making sure you actually do not just the reading on your own, but also the thinking. But Hume truly disliked the University of Edinburgh and other schools because he found that the curriculum was just so rigid. And he was reading books on the side, and particular books. And some of those books helped him realize that to truly learn, he had to become what's called an autodidact. Now, some people think autodidact means, you teach yourself, because didact means to teach, and auto means to teach yourself. And then they say, well, you could never possibly teach yourself. But that's not really what it means. What autodidacticism means is that you create your own learning programs. So what Hume used to do is he would read books, and then he would read the books that were referred to by the books. And so he would create a kind of curriculum on his own and teach himself on that basis. But the key is really just this. It's not random reading. He went after the books that were recommended in the books that he read, and he was specifically interested in books that questioned the validity of education. And so what he ended up discovering is that the education system is built, it has a history, and it often forces people through systems of control that don't serve us nearly as well as the propaganda machines make us think that they do. And here's a guy, if memory serves, who's born in 1711. So this is not some new thing like we often think, we're being duped by the system. No, even back then, people thought they were being duped by the system. And he didn't just think it. He had the evidence from authors who were documenting it. So from Hume, we learn that we should never just study the subjects that we want to learn or study the subjects that the institutions give us to learn. We also need to study how and why, historically, these subjects come to be of interest in the first place. Why are we being taught these subjects and not other subjects? Politics is the science and the art and the craft of what gets included and what gets excluded. And Hume realized that the disease of the learned, as he called it, led him to burnout and depression, largely because he was trying to do too many things at once. He was trying to force his mind into a shape it didn't want to take, and he was learning that there were many, many possible shapes, and the work of the many people who were essentially engaged in the work of forcing it upon him were forcing him to do rote learning, rote repetition. Why is this bad? Well, because there's memory techniques you could use, but it's even worse than that. In my research, I've discovered studies showing that rote repetition reduces your critical thinking faculties. Now, of course, there are scientific studies, and maybe they're wrong, and maybe rote repetition is just the greatest thing since sliced bread. But if you think about it, if you're repeating the same information over and over and over again from a system that's giving you information that has reasons that are not necessarily in your benefit as an individual, but are in the benefit of the system, well, that would reduce your critical thinking because it's shaping you to think in particular ways, not in the ways you might have chosen otherwise. So if you are forcing yourself to learn things that you don't want to learn and you're using rote repetition, well, you could indeed be giving yourself the disease of the learned, all while thinking that you're doing the right thing, that you're doing a good thing. And to a certain extent, if you want to live life never fulfilling your dreams, well, okay, fulfill the dreams of the state, no problem. But what ended up happening is that Hume realized the game and he stopped forcing himself to play it. He started to curate his reading instead. And while curating his reading by getting deeply involved in the kinds of books he was choosing to read and then following up by reading the books recommended by the authors he was reading, he helped heal his mind, and he got some really interesting secret sauce by skipping the university system altogether and taking off to France, specifically to a small town called La Flèche, where Jesuit monks were translating ancient texts that somehow had arrived in France from the Far East. Now, a scholar named Alison Gopnik, very brilliant researcher, she suggests that Hume may have been exposed to the principles of Buddhism and possibly even the Indian philosophy Advaita Vedanta. Whether it was Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, it doesn't matter, because he would have been exposed one way or the other to the concept of having no self. Myself, I have to wonder if Hume didn't go even deeper than that by essentially working with the monks to translate some of those texts himself. Now, that's pure speculation, but one way or the other, let's just say that he did encounter Advaita Vedanta. What the heck does that even mean? Well, in Sanskrit, it translates very simply. It says that the culmination of the knowledge of the Vedas is one, not two. Now, that's a mouthful for sure, and it took me a long time to actually understand what all that meant, and I had to memorize a lot of Sanskrit in order to work it out. Your mileage may differ with philosophies like these that bend your mind into a pretzel in order to suggest that everything you see is not infinite things, but just one thing. But I found it very helpful to wrap my mind around all of this, and I can just imagine how healing similar ideas must have been for Hume, who had these realizations about what was going on in the education system and how it wasn't necessarily working in his favor. And in my book here, The Victorious Mind, I talk about how I used memory techniques to memorize Sanskrit texts, like a certain extract from the Ribhu Gita. And it's so powerful because when you memorize some of what are called self-inquiry questions, you start to have metacognition. And some of those questions are like, to whom is this thought occurring? In what body are they occurring? Where are the thoughts occurring? When are they occurring? What ends up happening is that you begin to realize that the self that in some cases may feel depressed, or the self that may feel anxious, you can't find this person. It doesn't actually exist, not under any kind of skeptical inquiry. I feel anxious. Okay, well, where is the you that feels anxious? Where is it? Can you find it? Can you touch that person? Well, the answer is clearly no, because that feeling is appearing somewhere, but as soon as you start to inquire into it, you can't really quite find where, and often the inquiry process makes it disappear. So Hume clearly discovered something like this when he looked inside his mind and couldn't find a David Hume. He just found a bundle of perceptions: heat, cold, love, hate, thought upon thought upon thought, sometimes pain, sometimes pleasure. Tons and tons and tons of perceptions. And this realization sent him into a dark night of the soul. He even wrote a doctor about it. And the doctor didn't necessarily have any answers for him. But in reading Hume's own words in his letter to this doctor, I'm very sympathetic to what he describes, because I've experienced a dark night of the soul myself. And quite frankly, it was very difficult to share this in The Victorious Mind because it's a very dark journey. And frankly, it was terrifying at first. It was terrifying just to get there. And then it got even more terrifying when I started to do these inquiry questions. And my memory was constantly bringing back these questions over and over and over again. And then all of a sudden, my perception changed, and it was just like, and then I was just lost for a couple weeks. Like Hume, I found, however, that if you push through it, using the same tools that got you into that dark night in the first place, well, you come out the other side pretty much completely free. For example, I'll never forget the day that using the self-inquiry tools I memorized in Sanskrit completely removed my fear of death. It just blew out like a candle, and it never returned since. And this is not a speech about me. Hume had something very, very similar. This radical form of questioning, I think we all benefit if we get it deep into our memory. Does it have to be memorizing Sanskrit? Not necessarily. I don't know that Hume memorized Sanskrit. It's just very interesting that he wound up in France with these Jesuit monks. And he probably did some kind of study and practice in these mystic traditions, because the philosophy that he wound up writing that overturned so much of what was in the philosophical world until he came along in the West, well, it was inquiry-based and it was skeptical-based in the same way that the Advaita Vedanta tradition is based. So I don't think it's too much to say that Hume and his radical skepticism that helped cure his depression, or at least recover from it, was because he stopped worrying that there was such a person as David Hume, and he realized that this impression of Hume was really just a bundle of habits, and that habits can be changed. And if you read his works, the historical record and more recent investigations by people like Gopnik show us that Hume triumphed from training. And he's not alone in using the mind and memory to bounce out of a funk. Nor is the Buddha alone, or countless other practitioners. The key, if you want the ability to detach from anxiety, especially anxiety created from studying and cramming so much information into your head, well, you need to have some kind of system. And Hume had to travel to France to find it. I had to memorize dozens of Sanskrit shlokas that wind up amounting to thousands of words in order to do it. And if you want to be able to do that, you don't have to necessarily read The Victorious Mind. You can check out the description below. There's a link there that will give you a course that teaches you how I set up some of the memory tools that allowed me to do that, build the mental structures that let you learn faster and think clearer because you're choosing to memorize information that helps you in this way. But at the end of the day, what Hume came up with was not so much a cure for the disease of the learned, but a system, a process. And if you're interested in more information over time that will get you deeper and deeper into exploring the processes that free you from anxiety, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're new here, and let's work together to get this kind of knowledge out there, because I'm one of those but wait, there's more kind of guys. So yes, I ask you to subscribe. Yes, I ask you to hit the thumbs up, but there's more value for you. Because if I can drive us back to the disease of the learned, here's another element of the cure that Hume clearly used to get his brain working again. Now, James Harris doesn't use the word I'm about to share in his intellectual biography of Hume, but it leaps off the page to me. Because Hume intentionally rotated through multiple books. And that is a term Harris used, but this is a practice we now call interleaving. You really want to start interleaving if you're not doing it already, because so many people make the mistake that Hume originally made. Part of his funk, his anxiety, his depression was that he was cramming. He was pounding information into his head. But when Hume started to recover, he changed the way that he was studying. He didn't just grind on one of these big, giant, impossible philosophy books or history books this thick for 12 hours at a time. No, he started to rotate. He would read Tacitus for history, and then Butler for satire, then Virgil for poetry, and Virgil, of course, also for philosophy. Now, neuroscience in our time tells us that if we cram reading one text for hours at a time in one subject, it's going to lead to cognitive fatigue. But interleaving, the deliberate rotation between different topics, keeps the brain engaged. It literally creates more retrieval paths in the brain, more neurogenesis. interleaving, switching between books as you read, it's like cross-training fitness for your neurons. So if you're studying for a topic or you're studying for a language, don't just push. Take language learning as a very key example that translates to other things. Don't just memorize vocabulary. Maybe spend 15 minutes memorizing vocabulary. Then switch to watching a movie in that language so you're listening to the language. Then spend 20 minutes writing. Then spend 20 minutes speaking the language. And then go back to memorizing. And then read. Then watch. Then listen. Then learn and speak. All that sort of stuff rotationally creates what's called the levels of processing effect. It's very, very powerful. Rotation helps you retain. And at the risk of repetition, yes, I'm going to say it. But wait, there's more. There's a writer that Hume studied. He influenced Hume very, very much. His name was Shaftesbury. And he believed that the true person of intellect can never be a hermit. But there are many, many students who just never socialize. And Hume read these authors who belong to what we might now call the self-help genre, who kept stressing this point that you got to get out there and talk to other people. Not only do you got to get out there and talk to other people, but you have to become what was called a man of taste. And that meant that you had to experience aesthetic things, art, music, culture, and be able to speak about them in conversation. Play games. I mean, Hume played backgammon, and he also learned to cook. He was known as Le Bon David, the good David, because he was so fun to be around. He had so many different skills after, of course, he solved this depression of his. And this point about being social is so crucial. Memory and learning are skills that really pop when you spend lots of time with lots of people. So I read a lot of books when I was getting my PhD, but I also was in study groups and hung out with my friends as much as I could. I ran a small press with another guy named Rob Reed. I played music with all kinds of musicians. I was constantly going out and performing, speaking. I did spoken word albums, and I would perform my spoken word, and I had jobs and whatnot and so forth. But if you lock yourself in a room to learn, you're going to stagnate. You need to pull the information out of your head in multiple contexts and talk about it, because it's going to exercise multiple levels of your brain. Every context in which you draw from your memory and your mind, it gives you a deeper level of memory of what it is that you've talked about, because your processing gets rotational in the same way that you rotate through books. Anyway, this is a point that I think so many people that I read in the comments, they don't do, and I can tell they don't do. They tell me, but I don't have friends. I'm not social. I don't live in a town where I can go and talk to others. Well, I'm sympathetic to this. I used to live way down on Brown Road in Silver Creek in British Columbia, and I still took an effort to get social with people because, quite frankly, there wasn't the internet in the same way that there was then, but it took an effort anyway at that time. And I remember talking to these people sitting in the pub after class and making the effort to do so, even though I didn't really feel like it. And it just really helped, because you would talk about the things you were learning in class and spin them through your mind in multiple conversations with these different people that had different opinions, and you would just ultimately remember more. And it's just a beautiful thing. But Hume didn't start that way. He isolated himself, and it led him to this depression. So he turned that around through the so-called self-help industry of his time. Now, there's traps, and he was very clever in avoiding them, because Hume was not a fan of some of the self-help philosophy. For example, he proved that you don't need to be a stoic. Now, some people really like stoicism, and it's quite popular in our day, but a lot of stoicism is really about suffering and accepting suffering. And it talks a lot about what you should be. But Hume was skeptical of shoulds. And he used inquiry to work with what actually was. What is it that humans are? Not what they should be. And as a result, despite his rocky beginnings with depression, he ultimately started to really enjoy life. And because his brain was now flooded with the dopamine of good food, good conversation, good friends to have those conversations with, the philosophy he started to produce skyrocketed in value. And then he became a historian. And that made him, as far as I understand, quite wealthy. And you might also say that Hume enjoyed how he died. Sounds like a weird thing to say, but isn't that the ultimate test of a victorious mind? Hume was this notorious skeptic. He was a very public atheist at a time that was very religious, and it was dangerous to say that you didn't believe in God. When he was dying, people gathered around, waiting for him to recant. They wanted him to panic. They wanted the atheist in the foxhole to break down and pray. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but Boswell, the famous biographer of Dr. Samuel Johnson, apparently he visited Hume on his deathbed. He was himself desperate to see fear of death in Hume's eyes. He didn't find a shred of it. Hume was cheerful. He was cracking jokes about meeting Chiron or Charon, the ferryman, about to take him across the river Styx into the afterlife from the ancient Greek myths. Hume didn't believe in the ancient Greek myths any more than he believed in any other ideas from the various belief systems. He had long been utterly unconcerned with anything that couldn't be proven or demonstrated, and that's partly because he had just spent a lifetime training his mind. He had internalized the logic that freed him from superstition. He didn't need to hope for a future heaven because he had mastered the present moment, and he had rotated through book after book after book and helped us see that the disease of the learned does not need to be terminal. You can overwrite the stress and the fear and the anxiety and the forgetting that comes from cramming. And all you have to do is question the systems and the systems of systems that make up the education constantly churning around us with rote repetition of the same message over and over and over again, messages that do not serve us. We can look for and we can practice tools of memory improvement and self-inquiry. And by interleaving the topics that you study without cramming on any single one of them, and taking care to be more social about what you're learning in this way, you can build a mind that is resilient, sharp, and yes, happy, even victorious. So if you want to dive deeper into the exact techniques I used to share in the journey that Hume enjoyed to get himself out of depression, check out my book, The Victorious Mind. And if you want to start building one of the most powerful memory techniques I'm pretty sure Hume knew about, and even if he didn't use it, at least he knew about it. But how could you know about it and not use it? Well, this is a technique called the Memory Palace technique, and you can start learning it right now to absorb wisdom faster so you have more time to switch between multiple books. So check out my video next on how to use the Memory Palace technique for studying. I'll see you there. And until then, thanks for watching. Keep questioning everything. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic. And heck, question that recommendation too.